Welcome, everybody. A warm welcome from me. My name is Matthias Barth, and I'm trying to guide you through the next hour in our dialogue series. It is really a pleasure for me having you over. It might be good morning or good evening, depending on your time zone you're in and you're listening. It might be your first cup of coffee or your first glass of wine, depending the time zone you are in, or you stick to a glass of water, as it is in my case, for a moment. I'm really glad that we come together today, today where we celebrate Earth Day. And I think Earth Day is really a great opportunity for such a dialogue and conversation. And it is a great opportunity to reflect also for us individually a bit, reflect on how much we actually depend on our biological sources, how much our life not only depends on what we call Earth, but in how far we are really interwoven with so many processes that build the Earth we are living on. It shows how important it is really to act to preserving our planet and to rebuild a relationship to our planet. And this is what we are what we want to talk about today a bit more. And that is a pressing issue, as you all know. 2020 being one of the 3 warmest years on record, the past 6 years being, including 2020, being the 6 warmest years on record. So there are really pressing issues, as you all know, and this calls out for action. This needs us and each of us. But it's not only about individual behavior. Obviously, we all can make or should make a difference, but our individual action, or only our individual action, will not make the difference. It's really our voice we will need to raise, to call out also to politicians, to decision makers, to the corporate sectors, that they take over responsibilities as well, and that they help us build environments in which each and every of us can take over responsibility. And about this and many more, I want to talk today with our guest today, Mirian Vilela, and I'm really glad that she could make it and joins us early in the morning on her side. Mirian Vilela is the Executive Director of the Earth Charter International Secretariat and the Center for Education for Sustainable Development. She is coordinator of the UNESCO Chair on Education for Sustainable Development with the Earth Charter, and she served as a member of the UNESCO Expert Reference Group for the Decade of Education for Sustainable Development. Mirian holds a PhD in education from LaSalle University and a master's degree in public administration from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, where she was an Edward Mason Fellow. She is originally from Brazil, but has been living in Costa Rica for, I think, over 25 years now. And she really can bring us some insights and expertise on hands-on activities around the question of how can we reconnect with nature? What role does nature play for us, and what role can we play in the relationship with nature? And therefore, I'm really looking forward to. Mirian is also an advisory board member of our Institute for Sustainable Development and Learning. So here she already was a great asset for us in many cases. And she's an inspiring colleague. So I'm very proud and really delighted to have you over today. Mirian, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Matthias, and thank you for the invitation to join you today. And greetings from Costa Rica, where we are beginning our day, actually, with a glass of water, by the way. No wine.
Okay, it might be a bit early for wine. Yes, I'll join you. I'll join you with the water. That is no problem for the moment. So Mirian, we thought we'd do things slightly different today, as it is already the 3rd conversation we have in this series. And we started more with an, let's say, more academic, traditional style of having presentations and being on the safe side with PowerPoints and impressing people. But also with the feedback, we saw that really the most interesting part is the conversation. And So this time we invited you to really dive right with us right into conversation around the topic we mentioned. But still, I would really very much like to give others also a bit of an opportunity to better understand what you're working on, what is happening in your institute, and what sort of work you're involved in. So maybe you can give them a bit of a background so that we can better understand where your thinking is coming from.
So we are based here in Costa Rica, and I think I could just mention that I have been involved with the idea of sustainability for almost 30 years, actually for 30 years. And in the first, I would say, almost 10 years, it was very much about influencing policy making or developing policies on ESG or on sustainability. And I think about 20 years ago, I had this feeling that we need to infuse or figure out how to align the whole idea of sustainability of a new world with a new educational approach. So I think what really calls my attention since then is how can we make education really a driver to a more just and sustainable world rather than a driver to the unsustainable world that we are. Because if we look at, I mean, if I look at my family in Brazil, my grandparents, my parents, they had much less access to information and to education than what I did. And I certainly have much less access to information and education than my daughter and the upcoming generation. So there's more and more access to education and more access to information. And despite that fact that there's a growing access to information and education over the past 40 years, we still have the world that is not really driving towards that direction of a more just and sustainable world. And therefore that should make us question what then has been the role of education so far in driving the world towards a world where there is a lot of environmental degradation, a world with growing social disparities and injustice, and a world with growing conflict. And especially now, I think many of us would agree that in many parts of the world, there is a growing polarization in terms of political thinking, polarization in terms of the way in which we see the world. And therefore, I think the question is, okay, what has been so far the role of education, and education in the broad sense of the word, primary, secondary schools and higher education in the sense of formal education, but also non-formal education and above all informal education. When I look at the young generation, the teenagers, certainly my daughter, I have a 17-year-old daughter, and I look at her and I'm always constantly asking myself, what is really influencing her worldview? Is it me as a mother? Is it the school, the teacher? Mm-hmm. I think it's a combination of all of that, but I have to dare to think that informal learning through social media, through news, through films is actually feeding and informing and helping her to shape her own worldview. It's not even the school and it's not even the family. And it's really something that I cannot control, which is good. But anyway, so I think we should be asking, I think we are in the middle of a huge transition and of paradigm shift in terms of the role of education, of formal education system. I don't think none of us really know where we are heading. But there is no doubt that there is a huge transformation in terms of the role of education. And of course, COVID pandemic just came to give a push to make it faster.
I fully agree. And now you already mentioned a couple of things that I try to untangle them a bit and get them in a bit of order. Millions of questions popping up my head. First, let's start with the role of education. And I fully agree. And I mean, I think David Orr already, early on pointed that out, the state of the earth we are seeing right now, and even without any, I don't want to put too much doom speak on that. So because we also have we have quite some progress in some parts, but obviously we see a lot of impact and troublesome impact that we as humankind have on the earth. And this is not the work of the uneducated. It's rather, decisions of highly educated ones. So that really puts the question on, what is it actually we do learn? What do we need to learn? And as Arjen Walls might say, maybe we need to unlearn unsustainability first before we can start sustainability. So maybe let's start with that before we go on the role of informal and what could be done. Where did we take the wrong turn? What is your thinking about? What is going wrong in sort of mainstream education nowadays, where we get increasingly knowledge, also knowledge about the influences we have, and still see far too little action or action towards not the right direction?
Where did we go wrong, and when? I think it's in this separation of things, in the fragmentation of knowledge, and sometimes even in this the way we see theory here and practice there, as if we could generate theory without practice, and as if we could really do good things and practical things without a minimum of theory. So it's kind of been this separation of things. No, I think the way in which our disciplines are organized, you are expert on this field, and therefore you cannot be an expert in the other field. And therefore, I think we have made education systems, the way in which we learn, a lot of things are done that to make us see the world in a fragmented way. The way in which I think we learn through formal school system is really just leading us to see the world in a fragmented way. It's almost leading us to cut our possibilities of having, I would say, imagination, in a sense of creativity to the future, as if the education system is kind of helping to cut the wings or our capacity to see beyond. So when I'm in a room full of university students, that are, most of them spend so much time in looking at the current world situation and crisis, and just feed themselves with the lack of hope and despair, I get very, very frightened and frustrated. I think the education system or the education experience should help us to elevate our views, to see beyond the current situation, should instill in us the capacity to hope, instill in us the capacity to see creatively a different future. And therefore, it's kind of the education system or our education experience, I think it's going in the wrong direction when it's not helping us to see long-term or to envision different things, because it's so stuck in looking at the short term, and is so stuck in not helping us to build bridges and look at the relationship of current challenges, the relationship with past, present, and future situations. So I think it's almost, it's going wrong. So just to answer your question, in how it's not necessarily helping us to amplify our consciousness, to amplify our vision to the world. And I think one of the challenges is that education systems should certainly help us look at the current worldviews we have, question our assumptions, invite us to look at the world through different lenses by having opportunity to have dialogues with people that are in different cultures, in different contexts, and that have different areas of knowledge to help us amplify the way we see the world. Mm-hmm. So I think these are just a few points that I mean, there are many others, of course.
Yeah, and I will come to further points as well. But maybe let's stay with the worldview perspective for a bit. I think that is, getting also challenging worldviews and reflecting on worldviews is something very important, I think. Could you give our audience an example or some examples of how that is reflected in your work, or some sort of hands-on activities you did in educational work or projects you have been overseeing, so to get an idea of how we can get out of that trap in our traditional educational system?
Mm-hmm. Well, we have a center here that is located on the campus of the University for Peace that actually hosts a UNESCO chair on education for sustainable development with the Earth Charter. And the main focus of our work is really to look at how that intersection of sustainability values and how to bring that in education in a way that it's transformative and in a way that can help us expand our consciousness, especially our consciousness with regards to how we relate to one another as humans and how we relate to the large living world. So I think one thing that we do often in the way we do our courses is to bring people to nature. And it's an opportunity that we use to invite and encourage people, and self included, to be in nature, not to study nature, it's not to give names to trees necessarily, and it's not to see how many species do we have just next to us. Our education center is located on next to a forest, a tropical forest. It's actually 300 hectares of protected area, and a scientist or a biologist could go there and start studying the different species and how many species and etc. But our invitation is actually just to be there and to see how much our life is connected to our environment. It's not that nature is outside us. We are nature. No, we need the air we breathe, the water we have in our body, the food we eat. I mean, we are part of nature, and therefore, I think an example is when I can see many students that have spent most of their lives in urban areas and are totally not used to go and just be mindful that they have nature in them, and they have spent the whole life thinking that humans are here and nature is there, is when we work with them and invite them to see nature through their blood system, to see nature through their lungs, in the air they breathe, and just to experience nature. And therefore, we try to really work in inviting people not just to understand that cognitively, okay, human beings are nature, are part of nature, but to experience that. So an example is when I have seen many students actually that are with us in a park, in a forest, and they just share with us that they never really they never really even enjoyed being outside. They share with us how grateful they are that we just invited them to look around, to see things, to appreciate even the clouds, or to appreciate a flower or a bird, a butterfly, and see how they're connected to it, not as something that it's separate from them. So I think that that's one challenge that we try to address through the work we do. Again, it's not just one step is to recognize and understand that cognitively, but another thing is to just experience nature in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, and this brings us, to an interesting next aspect when it's about this experience part. And I'm glad you mentioned that, also the non-scientific approach to nature, to go out there. I have to admit, when I started also teaching, although I love to be outside and in nature, I always dared a bit, to bring people outside, because not being a biologist, and so often being in that trap of, you have to be the expert on everything. You have to cover your ground when you are the lecturer. Sort of that is sort of an yeah. It's been difficult around, and also I think this experience based is also an approach, where you're pushing the boundaries a bit, and you're leaving sort of the safeguard, because you cannot, at least this is my experience, and I'm curious what you think about that. So you can't control what is happening in terms of learning that much anymore, because it's not that you're transferring certain aspects and certain knowledge, but you need to also engage in a sort of an experiential space where you're not sure where it goes to and what is happening. So I think
we
that
have to
needs.
learn how to let it go. We have learned so much, and actually the education system is so vertical, and with so much planning, we need to learn certain things by certain time and in certain way, and learning really doesn't happen in that controlled way, and I think I often think to myself, by the way, and to the students that we engage with, is always to put an elastic band in our minds, and to always remind ourselves on the need to be flexible with the goals we set, flexible with the time, because if we are willing to go through an education experience that is vertical, that I think belongs to the old paradigm, we can try to have control. But if we are willing to generate a learning experience, we ourselves as educators, facilitators, need to learn how to be flexible and let it go, because the reality is that once you give the space for the learners to experience and share and reflect, then the process is not necessarily under your control anymore. It's part of the learning experience.
Yeah, I fully agree. Probably is what I'm trying to say. Is letting go might have not been always my strong suit when it comes to controlling the teaching environment. What I wonder then is if you engage your learners with these sort of experiences, especially as you say, you bring them out of a more urban area, and then they can experience nature in a very different environment at your place. And I mean, I've never been there. I've only seen pictures. I always I know that at some point I want to come there. Um, how do you make that a longer lasting, sort of deeper, transformative learning experience, so that it's not just an, okay, they go out there and they enjoy it a lot, but as we're talking about, making connections, isn't it sometimes difficult to really make the connections of your day-to-day life to sort of that very different experiences? And how do you foster that?
Hmm. Well, I think again it's a matter of trying to learn how to pause and reflect about experiences and about our lives, our inner lives, and how our inner lives are connected with the large living world. And this we can do even from the most central urban areas. And I actually often get the question of, okay, if my school is in the middle of a capital of a very big urban area, how can I make that happen? Should we just bring our student always to a forest or to the ocean? And that's of course not quite always possible. And I think again it's a matter of how can we infuse that kind of reflection even in classes of mathematics, history, language, in inviting people to go into that introspection and inner reflection about our inner lives, our connection with other human beings and with the large living world. And this can be done not necessarily in nature, but of course I think it helps when we are able to encourage people to, or we're able to take students or encourage them to spend more time or some time in nature. But it can be done anywhere in an urban area. It's just a matter of kind of where do we focus our minds and our attention and our hearts. I think sometimes actually one of the challenges that we currently have, I think everywhere in the world, is where to look at and where to focus our attention. And sometimes we are so busy during our day-to-day life that we don't stop to look at something that is around us or even our own feelings. And there is so much that we could learn if we stop to look at and appreciate. And this can be done anywhere, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. And this, that's an interesting point, because then it's also, that introspection and this reflection also brings us to the question of choices. And this is a great opportunity, so that I want to open up a bit to the audience as well. And I want to invite the audience. We do have that, you find that Q&A button in your Zoom webinar. And I will at least try as good as I can track questions that are raised there, and you can also vote up questions if you want to agree and think they are important. And we do have a first one, and I'm going to read that out in a bit, because I think that connects nicely to the choices here, and maybe I can get your opinion on that. I just want to invite the audience, to also, if you have other questions, if you want to join into the discussion, that is your opportunity, and I will try to cover these questions as good as I can. So one of the first questions was exactly about, this the question on where do we want to focus and on choices. So the question here that is asked is, how can education make us choose better, and not only about sustainable or not or unsustainable choices, but every aspect of life. And it refers to especially when making girls and women making choices. So the question here to you, Mirian, is how do you see the question of choice in the context of education for sustainable development, or generally quality education?
Well, choice. We make numerous choices every day in our lives, independently of who we are, even a small child to more elderly people, and independently of the work we do, we make numerous choices every day, and therefore it's good to ask ourselves what inform our choices, what drives our choices. So some of it has to do with our culture, with what we learned from our families and the culture where we come from. Some of it come from our belief systems, I would say most of them. And some of it come from the information that we acquire through our journey in life, that inform and influence the choices we make every day. And I think it's quite useful when we learn and when we stimulate ourselves, but also through education, in thinking about the impact and the consequences of our choices. Is the choice that we are making now, today, either of buying something or not buying something, or consuming one thing or another, how much that is impacting, or how much that is undermining or supporting, contributing with the well-being of people, with the well-being of the planet? How much of my choices every day in my lives, and sometimes in an institution or a school, independently of where we are, how much one small choice or big choice, a decision that we make every day, how much that is impacting the social environment? How much is that impacting the natural environment, in the short run, in the long run? As you know, the whole idea of sustainability is inviting us to amplify our sense of responsibility, with present and future generation. It's inviting us to amplify our sense of solidarity with others, and again, not only human beings, but the large living world. At least that is the worldview that is articulated in the Earth Charter, emphasizes the importance for us to see not only, or to care not only for the well-being of the human family, or not just for the well-being of my family or my country, but the well-being of the human family, but also to care for the well-being of the large community of life that are beyond humans. And therefore, I think the effort here is to stimulate, to feed that kind of consciousness with regards to the impact that we generate everywhere we go, and be conscious, be mindful of that, and therefore, with that kind of cognitive information and heart and feeling, we can drive our choices to better contribute to the well-being of the common good, or the large community of life. Which I think it's, of course, crucial for us to think that even when we enter in a room, I often think about that, even here in this room meeting or Zoom or in the classroom, when we enter into a room, we have to be mindful of what do we generate, even with an energy we bring, the knowledge we bring, but also the energy, the feelings that we bring in when we walk by people or when we come in a room. And therefore, what is the kind of energy that we would like to irradiate? What's the kind of seeds that we would like to spread through our talk, through our choices, through the way in which we interact with others? So I think education really needs to invite us to constantly think and be conscious, mindful of that, the choices we make, what's the impact it generates, but also what do I bring in, because we are generating impacts in people's life, and in the natural world, throughout our daily decisions.
Yeah, a couple of things there where I wanna, which I wanna pick up. First, maybe the way you refer to that. At the end of the day, that really relates to values and thinking and reflecting about values and changing values, right? Which is something crucial, which is but on the very far end from a very cognitive approach we often have, when we think about knowledge. So that you're bringing in heart and thinking about values is something slightly different. And it is also something in education often criticized, we can't prescribe certain values. How dare we? We try to change people's values and thinking. It's knowledge we can talk about, but in an emancipatory thinking, really, it is up to the individual with what values they come up and So this is something, at least and especially, and you know that in higher education, you know, this is sort of beyond thinking, you know, with the small kids, you might do that, but it's already a bit of a grayish area. But value thinking in higher education is something I do have a couple of colleagues where they say this is off the table. You know, this is not higher education. What is your take on that? How do you bring in such discussions around values and
Yeah.
aspects like that?
Thank you, Matthias, for asking that question. It's so interesting how values education, or bringing in values into the education realm, can so often generate that thinking. And there's a lot of skepticism around it, indeed. And I think it happens because there is a feeling, I would say, that values education is vertical. There is a kind of, some people only perceive values education as something that is imposing, vertical, in getting people to learn certain values by heart, and that's it. Whereas, at least from our perspective, values education has to do with inviting us to examine the way in which we make decisions, why we made those decisions, what are the consequences of our decisions and actions. Values education, from our perspective, from my perspective, it's really a space for us to examine our day-to-day lives, to examine our decisions, to examine what has driven us to make those decisions and what are the impacts of those decisions. So it's really about examining and questioning our assumptions. It's about examining and questions what are the underlying roots of our worldviews. Kind of, so it's not really about learning things by heart, but it's about being mindful of what is good, what is right or wrong, from a perspective of common good, not only from the perspective of my culture or my feelings or my family, but from the perspective of common good. So from my perspective, we need, actually there's an urgent need for us to demystify that thinking, or understanding that no, we cannot do values education because would be imposing on people. The current materialistic society is actually doing a lot of explicit education that has to do with promoting a certain values on materialistic life without being scared, or without being very timid of doing that. It's very explicit. They're specifically promoting a culture sometimes a worldview that is based on the values of the haves, of materialism. And they are not shy of doing that, right? And I think we need to be very clear and cautious at the same time about the fact that we do need to create spaces for us to open that, our cultures, to open our even what we have learned from our families and our culture, and actually question our assumptions from the perspective of values education. From that angle of values education means examining our assumptions, examining our values, not learning things by heart, but learning things by looking at things from different perspectives, but also learning from the perspective of what are the consequences of our decisions in the short run and in the long run. The consequences not only from the perspective of human beings, but the consequences, or even the current generation, but also the consequences with regards to future generations, or with the large living world. So I think values education from our perspective, and even when it comes to the Earth Charter, because we, as you know, we do have an Earth Charter. It's an ethical framework. The Earth Charter is kind of is an instrument that articulates the values and principles that could guide us towards a more just and sustainable and peaceful world. So it is there. So people often confuse by thinking that when we do Earth Charter education is about asking everybody to learn the Earth Charter by heart and infuse those values and principles in their minds, and it doesn't happen that way. That's not transformative learning, and that's certainly not values education from our perspective. We basically invite people to look at their charter and to use it as an instrument to stimulate dialogue and to stimulate a connection with their day-to-day life, day-to-day decisions, and to stimulate an imagination about how could the world would look like, because we do need to amplify our capacity to envision the world in a different way, different from the current situation that we have in the world of so much conflict, urban conflict or conflict in different areas, a world in which we currently have in many places that have so much little tolerance for differences, a world that we currently have in terms of so much social injustice and environment degradation. So the question here is, what are the values that have taken us to the current situation we have, and therefore what are the values and principles that could guide us to a different direction, to create a new kind of world civilization, planetary civilization.
This also needs or relates nicely to a question that was raised here, and maybe you can. And I think there is the Earth Charter really is a powerful instrument, and I really like the way you're working that and using that as an sort of a reflection tool. So speaking about these values that could guide us also, to a different sort of connection to nature and a reconnecting approach, what are some of these underlying core values that you think are very important? And maybe to connect that to Kiran's question, who's asking about the value of kindness. Is that something that comes into play there as well, or that resonates somehow to what you're thinking about?
Thank you. Thank you, Kiran. It's nice that you're here. It actually, just by the fact that you're here, it fills in the room with kindness, I would say. It's so nice. In terms of, so the question is, what are the key ideas, I guess, that are articulated in the Earth Charter, and the role of kindness? So there is a specific vision of stimulating, cultivating, not imposing, but cultivating a sense of interdependence and connection with the large living world. So this is certainly something that is embedded and is articulated in the Earth Charter. There are some core ideas. So one is the sense of interdependence and interconnectedness with a large living world. That is something that it's articulated in the Earth Charter, but it's also something that we specifically would like to continue to nurture and cultivate. In another one is the sense of responsibility and solidarity. Responsibility with what? So responsibility with the well-being, responsibility with the common good, nurturing the sense of we all have a shared responsibility with the well-being, not only of present generations, but with the future generations. So that's the kind of values and principles that are articulated there. So the opposite of that is to generate a sense of disconnection, and which is, I think, what the mainstream society is kind of navigating or swimming in that swimming pool lack of sense of responsibility or care, even with present or future generations' well-being. Or I think the mainstream society is navigating around that sense of disconnection with others and sense of disconnection with what life is all about. And therefore, we do have a specific, I would say, worldview that we would like to nurture and cultivate in people, which is the opposite of the current mainstream culture that is focused on materialism. Mm-hmm. And so it has to do with interconnectedness, a sense of interdependence, a sense of responsibility with the well-being of others, kind of a looking at things from a 360 degree approach, like enlarging or broadening our worldview. And of course, at the heart of the Roshara lies an ethic of care and respect. Not only care and respect for among human beings, but with a large living world. So there is a worldview, a specific worldview that is articulated in the Roshara that invites us to move away from our anthropocentric approach to decision-making, anthropocentric approach of walking through our lives, but inviting us to expand our views, to have a more life-centric approach, to invite us to see our role as humans as part of this large living world, as part of the community of life, as part of nature. So I think when we have that sense of connectedness among humans of different cultures, when we have that deep sense of consciousness with regards to our connection as human family, our deep sense, not only cognitive, but also in our heart and feeling with regards to our relationship with the large living world, this notion or sense of kindness would emerge naturally in the way, in our behavior, in our attitudes, because it's kind of a consequence of that. And again, there is something very strongly articulated in the Roshara that says that we need a change of mind and a change of heart. So again, it's not just about learning things from our cognitive selves, but really experiencing things from our inner self. So I think when we are able to experience that and have that kind of new consciousness with regards to our deep connection with others in the large living world, kindness would be flourishing, irradiating from us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And so now and this is a bit of a challenge. I have two questions. I try to somehow connect them so as to how I understand them. And I start with the latter one, because I think that is really, that's also an important and a quite prominent critique when we get into too much of an individual approach. So we think about values and assumptions on the individual level, but so one of the critiques, and this Elaine is mentioning, that is then the so what question. You know, when we teach future generations to care and be responsible, even in an emancipatory approach, you know, to reflect on assumptions, aren't we shifting? And here I quote the question: aren't we shifting our responsibility to the students who actually have limited power to transform the system? So do we overburden individuals? That is, I think that is a general question around education for sustainable development. What is your take on that?
Well, I think it's good not to say that the solution for the current world problems and challenges are in the hands of future generations. I think it's certainly not a good way to go to articulate that thinking. Not in children, not in the hands of children, not in the hands of youth. It's in the hands of everybody. You know, actually, there is a principle in the Roshara that it's I think it's 2b, that says the more knowledge we have, the more power we have, the more responsibility we have with addressing the common good. I mean, I'm paraphrasing it, of course. I don't know it by heart, but the idea here is that it depends on where we are. It depends on the position we have. It depends on the knowledge and the power we have. We have more or less responsibility to address a certain challenge. And I think that's something that it's good to be stimulating in our inner self and minds. Again, I do not think that we should put the burden of solving all of this in the future generations. I think it's a shared responsibility with people, institutions, and by the way, institutions is actually articulated function only by people who are around it. And it's not just by the north or south, it's like depending on where we are and the positions we occupy. The fact is we all make decisions every day, decisions that impact, that have a big impact in our own ways and in contexts. And I think the important thing here is for us to, again, to stimulate a thinking about what is the impact of not caring? What's the impact of not being responsible? I see something in front of me and I don't take the responsibility to address it. I'm acting in a careless way with regards to how I make decisions. I'm talking, or I'm having an attitude of lack of respect for others or lack of respect to life support system. And then what's the impact of that? So when we look at the consequences of what happens when I'm able to act with a sense of solidarity and responsibility, and what happens when I'm acting with a sense of lack of solidarity, of irresponsibility, what happens? And then when we see the consequences of that, and then we say, oh yeah, I can see that the consequences is not only on others, but it's also even on my own self and culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that, and because that you earlier you mentioned your 17 years old daughter and where she's learning, and I want to at the very end I want to go back to that role of formal and informal learning, but just to stay in that for a moment. My daughter just turned 18, and she's also very good. You know, she's a vegan by heart, and you know, when I not walk the talk, she can be, you know, the harshest criticism of the world. And we often have these discussions about, you know, what does responsibility then mean? And I see that, you know, in sort of my environment here with lots of kids now in the Fridays for Future sort of movement, and very active, but also often very frightened about the future and future outlooks. We have a lot these discussions about, you know, how much influence can you have with your individual behavior and individual change, which is an important part, but it's not the only part. There's also, you know, the institutional, the political part, and you also have
society in general.
yeah, the society in general. But you are, as you rightfully said, you are, every individual is a part of the society, and we, you know, by demanding certain actions, can also put influence on political decisions, for example, and so that is sort of that indirect responsibility we can take there, and changes that are happening there. So it's not only, you know, always the individual who needs to save the world, but through action like responsible consumption, you know, there are also indirect effects. And we have a lot of these discussions going on to also, you know, put that a bit into perspective. What is your take on that sort of individual social role and responsibility?
Well, individuals, I think that's where we start. No, we start with ourselves. It starts with a decision. It starts with our day. day-to-day decisions. It starts with our first steps, and that we can make a decision, right? Our own selves, for kind of at that individual level. But we do not exist as an individual without our communities and the society. But I think one is constantly influencing the other. Society and community are influencing the individual, and the individual is often influencing the society and community. So it's kind of, again, we cannot separate that. But I think in terms of moving it from a individual level to a more community and societal level, it has to do with collaboration and partnership. It has to do with communication and aligning ourselves with others. It has to do with collaborating with those who have a common vision, shared purpose, aligning and collaborating, because of course each one, either individuals or institutions, bring different things to address something. So collaboration is crucial to take things to a higher level. But I'm often thinking these days about the importance to look at the ones who are not on the same boat collaborating. Looking at why we are not on the same boat, if I may say, in terms of sharing a common vision and knowledge about the needs to change the current or change the direction of our world. And how can we better communicate? How can we better build bridges with those who don't see the world through the same lens that we are seeing? And I think that's a key challenge for us, is how to, in my mind, I envision these bridges, building bridges with the world with those people who are living in a world that don't have the same frame, and how to improve the way in which we communicate in such a way that when we approach, we are not going to hit the walls. Especially the environmental movement, by the way. I think there is kind of in the mindsets of many people, young people, teenagers, or whoever, that says, oh, here comes the environmental movement people. And then there is a quickly reaction of putting walls, or I cannot hear, or this is your thing and this is my thing. And I think we have a huge challenge that we need to take to figure out how to better communicate, not come join our boat, but no, let me come to where you are, meet where you are with the way you are framing the world, and then incorporate this thinking and this worldview in the context where people are. I think that's an important challenge, because often people do not want to move away from where they are to join someone else's movement or someone else's boat. They want to be on their boat, right? So therefore, is how can we jump on their boat and just change the direction by incorporating these ideas in a way that people can listen, can open their eyes, and have really, I think this can only happen through deep dialogue, listening, and demonstrating an ongoing, constant sense of respect and care, even for those who think in a different way than we do. Unless we're able to do that, I mean, there's no dialogue, right? Anyway, and we'll be always talking among ourselves who like to talk about the things we like to talk.
Exactly, and forgive me, I see time is flying, and we are already a bit in overtime. So, but maybe one last point, and I want to bring that back to where you started from, with the role of education, because I found that super interesting. And that is the question, where do we get information from? Where is sort of our learning actually happening, and where is a future generations learning happening? Is that so much in formal education, or you mentioned social media? And when I think about these conversations and these deep dialogues, we see, social media taking a more and more important role, although we might have, sometimes be very much closed into certain bubbles of certain communications. But you probably see that with your daughter, as I see it with my daughter, how sort of different ways of communication and learning are shaping up. Where do you see that going, and what role do you see for the more formal education, and what do you see for the role of informal, non-formal education there?
Well, that's a big question. But when I think about school, I think it's creating a culture within a school. It doesn't happen from one day to another. But I think educators and school principals, administrators, and students actually should be engaged and involved in creating a school culture that is caring, that is respectful, that is mindful. Creating jointly a school culture requires an everyday, ongoing effort. But it requires a specific intention of creating a culture within the school that is caring, that is sensitive, that is kind, that is responsible, etc. That is sensitive to issues of social justice, that is sensitive to issues regarding creating a culture of peace. So I think that can be a clear intention that of a school environment. That can be in the whole school, it can be in a classroom, but certainly requires all different actors of the school to engage in that ongoing process of what's the kind of culture we want to create in our school? What's the kind of culture we want to cultivate and nurture in our classroom? So I think that's a kind of ongoing question that needs to be asked within a school environment. Knowing well that a school is not detached from the world, it's not detached from the community, and let alone now in social media. But I think a school environment that can be looking even at the current issues and situations in the community, in the country, in the world, and bringing it back to the school and relating it to the subjects that are relating, and bringing it back to the day-to-day schools and subjects that need to be addressed. But again, questioning consequences, impact, assumptions, questioning what's driving those decisions. So I think schools need to envision their role more as facilitators, rather than, of course, bringing in knowledge. I have to say that every day when I have something new, and I'm very happy to share with my daughter, and I share, and often she comes back to me and say, I know. So, and I'm like, how do you know? She's certainly more informed than I am in terms of world issues and situations, and she's just a teenager. So she's much faster than I am. She's really accessing a lot of information, not only through the school, but through all the different channels that it's actually that she's listening to. I think the question for the school and the parents is to gently offer different wins for different wins, and invite them to look at things from different perspectives, often in a respectful way, even if they think in a different way, actually, especially if they think in a different way than we do. We are not here to impose, but I think schools and parents are here to help them think through things through the lens of broadening their minds, and help them to examine what is going on, what is happening through different lenses and angles, and also help them to always look at the long term, the mid term, the short term consequences of something that is going on, so that with that we can stimulate a sense of care and responsibility. I think that, anyway, that's among others, I think the challenge that we have in our hands.
Yeah. But that is an excellent summary, I think. And for me, these are clear sort of take-home messages. You know, I think this idea of rather being a facilitator and creating and working also. Second message, working towards such a cultivation of a culture of care and kindness and responsibility. I think that really nicely summarizes sort of some of the ideas we share on education for sustainable development, I guess, and what also, you know, pretty much summarizes my understanding of the work that you are doing there. So yes, as I said, we are not only a bit, we are quite in overtime. So thanks for your patience and thank you so much for the conversation. I really enjoyed that. That was really great, and I think that was a good starting point, especially at Earth Day. Thanks to all the participants who joined us. Although I could not pick up on every question, I hope I covered at least some of them. Thank you very much for that valuable input as well. And Miriam, thanks so much for joining us early in your morning. That was really a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to further have these discussions on other occasions as well.
Thank you very much, Matthias. All the best and happy Earth Day. Let's
Yes,
have Earth Day every day.
you too. And to all the participants who listened in, there are multiple options for us also to catch up on what we are doing next, also with this conversation series. So sign up to our newsletter or connect on social media as you see it here. We will have our next conversation talk on the 3rd of June. So I'm already happy to invite you to that. And I would be glad if you join again. Have a nice evening, morning, lunch, wherever you're listening to, and having that cup of coffee or glass of wine on Earth Day. Thank you very much and bye-bye.